And yes, we are back. It is Isaiah. We have an OMB special for you, brought to you by FlyersNittyGritty.com, Jim South Street, 400 South Street in Philadelphia for the best cheesesteaks and hoagies in the greatest, grandest 40-year tradition. And if you live down near Jim South Street, make sure that you get over there. If you can't, they use DoorDash. So no excuses if you live down there, 400 South Street, Jim South Street. Best steaks you can get in the Philadelphia tradition. And with that, let's introduce the great Dan Silver here to talk about the breaking Flyers news about John Tortorella.
Hey Isaiah, I'm doing good, man. It's been a crazy month, all kind of like weird physical stuff. I'm feeling a lot better, and some exciting Flyers news, I think, and exciting things to talk about impacts and whatnot. So it should be pretty fun talking about Torts.
Yeah, it was long speculated that Tortorella had the inside on the job. In fact, Jason Martinez said on one of his broadcasts that John Tortorella has wanted this job since AV was fired. Maybe John's revenge for AV taking over in New York. I don't know. But he's the 23rd head coach of Flyers history, two-time Jack Adams Award winner in 2004 and 2017. And there are some narratives that are being weaved around this story. But before we get into that, looking at John Tortorella, Dan, why don't we start with like some positive attributes that this coach can bring to the franchise based on his long history of success?
Yeah, to me, it's a very good fit when looking at what some of the deficiencies have been with this hockey team over the past number of seasons. And when we talk about those deficiencies, let's think about some of them. They're a team that notoriously has gotten off to slow starts. They're a team during games, individual games. They're a team that, notoriously has been easy to play against, a little bit soft, maybe not going that extra mile to make the play. A team that there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of accountability. We've had coaches and GMs and players that talk a good game about accountability, but how many times after a game can you hear Claude Giroux or another player say we have to play better before it's meaningless, right? Like,
right.
We know you guys aren't going to play better. Like, stop saying that, although we know you sort of have to. But what we've got in Tortorella is a coach who's most known for holding players accountable. He's also, the way that the Flyers play makes you wonder about their practice habits, how good of the practice has been. And that's another thing with Tortorella, that he's supposed to run very good practices. He's known for having extremely difficult training camps, a lot of running, wants his team to be in extremely good shape going into the season. And if a player is not doing what he thinks they should be, he's going to tell them. I've seen some comparisons between him and AV where people are saying, well, AV was supposed to come in and hold people accountable. I think the difference is, for me, there's a couple differences. One is the communication skills and tactics. It sounds to me, from what I've heard from people around the organization, that over the past year, AV just sort of tuned out. Like, he would rip players publicly. He said stuff about JVR. He said stuff about Voracek. He said stuff about Carter Hart. But it didn't seem like behind the scenes he was then having conversations with these guys and in-depth discussions. It kind of felt like Vigneault didn't want anything to do with this team or the players for the last year that he was here. Well, what they say about Tortorella is that, he's known as fiery and brash, and he'll make comments about players publicly, but that behind the scenes, he's an extremely good communicator. And he leaves no questions with any players about what he thinks about how they're playing, what he thinks they need to do to improve. He's the kind of guy who communicates with players and has players' backs if they will go out and do what he's saying they should do and perform and try hard. And so, to me, him being here and the fact that he communicates with players and that he holds players accountable, there's going to be no excuses anymore on the parts of these players. And if there's players that just aren't fitting, as we suspect there may be some guys that just, for whatever reason, can't be part of a winning culture, he's going to tell Chuck Fletcher, this guy needs to go. Like, Tortorella is not going to – he's not going to beat around the bush with stuff like that. So I think he's going to hold players accountable. I think he's going to, instill work ethic in these guys. And I think he's going to allow us to kind of figure out who are the guys that we need to keep around as part of a winning culture.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. It was an interesting juxtaposition by Jordan Hall looking at Tortorella and Alain Vigneault. The numbers are very comparable. They won a comparable number of games. But I agree with you. If you want to dig in a little deeper between those two coaches, that it's the behind the scenes work that Tortorella has gained the credibility where if you ask the guys who played for him what they think of him, it's more likely to be a positive. Whereas with AV, it's crystal clear. He kind of checked out after the pandemic. When things didn't go his way, it just set something off in him, or it broke him. I can't say it any other way. And it wasn't the same guy. Tortorella is who you see. Whereas AV is kind of, a little more political. And I think that accounts for a big difference. And especially, like I mentioned, when you talk to guys that played for both coaches, you're going to get a different feedback pattern. With Tortorella, they'll say, yeah, he's tough, but he cares about you, and it was really hard to find negative things to say about John Tortorella.
Yeah, it's from when AV came in, and I wanted to like him from the start, and the team did pretty well when he came in. Even despite all that, whenever I'd hear him talk and watch him during press conferences, the first guy that would always pop to my mind, and I don't know if you watch his TV show, was John Hamm's character from Mad Men, Don Draper, who was, the head sales guy at this huge sales agency. And he just came across as very polished, but you don't trust the guy. Like, I sort of got those vibes from the start from Alain Vigneault, that he just was sort of a very polished guy, but maybe didn't want to get into the weeds a little bit and maybe didn't communicate that well with guys. I think he did those things fairly well probably in the beginning, but then, like you said, after the pandemic, for whatever reason, he just kind of tuned it out. It's been interesting. There's been a lot of chatter on social media, and even some players have, come out, and, Matthew Barnaby tweeted something about how, he's doesn't know how this is going to work with the players in Philly. And a lot of guys are saying, a lot of ex-Torts players are saying to him, like, oh, these Philly guys are going to want out. I don't know if it was a joke or not, but Brandon Dubinsky tweeted yesterday, prayers to all the players in Philly. And Dubinsky played for Torts for a number of years. I don't know if that was a joke or not. It didn't seem like it. But then on the other side, you've got Cam Atkinson, who obviously played. He's the only Flyers roster player who played with Tortorella. And he played under Tortorella for a while. And he apparently has all along been a huge advocate for the Flyers to bring in Tortorella. And so that says a lot right there. Atkinson has been crucial parts of teams that have had success under Tortorella. And part of me wonders if Atkinson looks forward to the accountability that the Tortorella is going to bring. So I think the fact that there's a guy in our current locker room who's excited about Tortorella is meaningful to me. And then you've got guys like Zach Werenski, who's one of the better defensemen in the league. And he's talked publicly about how him and Tortorella got off to a rocky start. Tortorella really wanted him to specifically do some things to improve his game in the early years, and that they butted heads a lot. But then he says that sort of Tortorella did help him get his game to where it had to be, and that now he realizes that, Tortorella had this great influence on him. It's almost like Tortorella feels it's like a familial relationship that he develops with these players, where he will, it's like a father-son type of thing. Like, you're going to be harder than your son on anyone. You're going to hold them accountable, but you're going to have an emotional relationship with them. And it seems like that's the kind of relationship Tortorella tries to develop with every player that he has. So, I don't buy in too much to all these ex-players who are sort of out there talking negatively about it, especially because I don't really care what these players care about it. Like, we acknowledge the fact that this is a team that, for whatever reason, the sum of the parts is much less than the individual components. They're not a super talented team, but their talent dictates that they should be better than they have been. And I think hopefully Tortorella is going to get to the bottom of that.
Yeah, and that's a Freudian slip there because, Barry Trotz was on everybody's mind, and we're not even really sure what Barry Trotz wants to do. He buys a home in Nashville. Maybe he's looking at, being there in retirement, or maybe he's looking at management there at one point. And now I'm hearing that he's going back and interviewing again in Winnipeg. But either way, he's not coming to Philadelphia. And so we can move on from that. The concern I've had, and I want to touch on some other things, back referencing what you were talking about, but I want to get to some of the concerns I have, because I pointed out in a tweet last night that both the LA Kings with Tom McClellan and Toronto Maple Leafs with Mike Babcock hired guys that had pedigree, were winners. In Babcock's case, obviously he won a cup, went to 2 finals with the Red Wings, and won a gold medal. They were willing to go through a bit of pain as the management did the right thing, looking at the roster, knowing they needed to make certain changes, get rid of certain players, basically go through a retool. And on our last show, which of course you weren't able to make it, I'm glad you're feeling better. We talked to John Hoven, the mayor, who's been covering the LA Kings for the longest time, and he talked about how the Kings kind of did what Hextall tried to do, and are now reaping the rewards. And my concern is, well, Tortorella is not going to come here unless they're going to go all Paul Holmgren in the offseason and squander a whole bunch of assets thinking this team is much better than they actually are, because you can't get blood from a stone. We've talked about repeatedly how the Flyers are like an 80 or an 85-point team. If everything goes well, people are generally healthy, they shouldn't have been a 61-point team. They have some talent. They've been building it for years, but it's a lot of mid-six talent. It hasn't meshed well together, like you mentioned. Now, are they willing to do the right things with the right guy in place, installing the right schemes, and maybe more importantly, instilling the right kind of culture, something the Flyers haven't had in almost a decade? Or are they going to go down the latter-day Holmgren path of doing what I talked about earlier, taking a lot of young players, draft picks, whatever, and just trying to, quote, win, whatever that means? And I don't think that's going to turn out well. That's really my main concern. Had they hired Barry Trotz, or right now with John Tortorella?
Yeah, and this is where the no good answer part comes in for me. Like, I don't think that Comcast was ever going to have the appetite to engage in a full-scale rebuild. And to me, what a full-scale rebuild means is that you're making moves to try and get out from under some of these albatross contracts, and you're making moves to try and be as bad as possible for next season. Because the draft next year is supposed to be a generational draft where there could be a handful of guys who could become generational talents, at least 2 for sure that they're saying are going to be potentially generational talents. The Chicago Blackhawks are making no secrets about the fact that that's what they're doing. They're trying a full-scale rebuild. Sounds like they're going to try and trade away Alex DeBrincat, who's 24 years old, one of the best young scoring forwards in the league. They want to trade him away, it sounds like, because they don't want to be good next year. So we can talk about this a little bit later, but I have some thoughts, concerns that the Flyers may move that number 5 pick in the draft to try and maybe get a guy like DeBrincat. But I don't think that Comcast has I don't think they're willing to sit through a full season where this team is horrible, no one's in the seats, as much as we kind of feel that that's the best path to go down, it doesn't seem like they have the appetite to deal with that. And so I'm sort of viewing it through the lens of knowing that they're not going to do that. They're not going to allow for a full rebuild. They are going to try and do whatever they can to get better for next season. I'm sort of at the standpoint, like I'm just going to be entertained, like seeing what they do and how they try and do this, and watching Tortorella interact in this scenario. I've given up hope of this team being a cup contender anytime soon. And so it's more like, okay, let's see what happens. The James Van Riemsdyk thing is going to be fascinating, right? Like, he has 1 year left at $7 million. And the Flyers can't make a big splash in free agency unless they get rid of that JVR contract. But they're going to have to give up. I think Anthony Sanfilippo or Russ Joy at some point had a poll on Twitter, like, would you trade the 2024 Panthers first round pick that we got, Giroux, to a team just to get them to take 1 year of JVR's contract? It's insanity. Like, why would you ever give up a first round pick to get rid of 1 year of JVR when JVR is going to be off? If you just keep him on the roster, he will be off your payroll for next offseason. And we all know this team's not winning the cup next year. So if this team's not winning the cup next year, why would you even entertain giving up anything to get a team to take JVR? But I think they're going to. Like, hopefully they're not going to trade a first round pick to someone. And actually, yesterday Vegas traded Evgeny Dadonov because they wanted to get rid of his contract to take on 4 years of Shea Weber's contract, which they think they can bury on long-term IR. I'd have rather done something like that. Like, hey, take JVR. We'll take 4 seasons of Shea Weber on long-term IR, because then you're not at least giving up draft picks. But yeah, I think the Flyers are going to give up draft picks for JVR. And part of the reason that the rebuild, in my mind, would be also very difficult is because the Flyers don't have a second round pick this year. This year's draft is not supposed to be great from a top heavy perspective. But what I'm reading is that this year's draft is going to be very deep from like a pretty good player standpoint, to the point where the Flyers second round pick that they traded away in I think it was the Ghost trade. I think that pick that they traded away, that's going to haunt them, that they gave away the second round pick this year.
What, also, the Ghost is going to haunt them? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. That trade is going to haunt them. Also, they don't have a second round pick next year. Next year, again, is supposed to be a spectacular draft. They traded away their second round pick next year in the Ristolainen trade, I believe. So it's a combo of those two trades, the Ghost one and the Ristolainen one. They don't have second round picks the next 2 seasons. How are you even going to try a complete rebuild when you don't have second round picks? Like, to me, again, that makes the argument for trying a full rebuild sort of comical, because you don't even have the draft capital to try and do a full rebuild. So they're in this no man's land where I just don't see a path to huge success. And I'm just sort of interested to see what happens this offseason. How do they get someone to take JVR? I think trading Travis Konechny, I feel like, is going to be high up on their priority list, because he makes $5.5 million, and they can kind of replace him with guys on entry-level contracts who theoretically could be close to his production level, at least from the past 2 seasons. But yeah, it's going to be a little bit of scorched earth this year to try and improve this roster so that Tortorella has a little more firepower to work with. I really hope they don't trade that number 5 overall pick.
It would be a big mistake. I don't think, with the level of mid-6 talent the Flyers have, that they would have to do the kind of teardown that they should have done when Hextall took over. That would be a full-fledged teardown rebuild. I think they're in that middle space where if they took a step back, kept JVR, kept all their young assets, and picked strategically certain young players they could package with maybe a second round. We don't have second round picks, but try to find a way you can get first round draft picks, and maybe this year you're going to be more middling. And the next year, this next draft in 23, you don't have to have a top 10 pick. If you're in the top 10, top 20, you're still going to get a good player. If this draft is similar to 15, if it's similar to the draft in 03, and they're comparing it to those drafts, right? So I'm just thinking it doesn't have to be a spectacular rebuild for them to get a little bit better. They just have to get their hands on first round picks, and they have to clear contract space and maybe give up some young players to do that. But the young players that they're going for are going to be at a higher level. And that is the point. The high level talent is just not there. The Flyers have really one first pair defenseman, in my opinion, who can't stay healthy, in Ryan Ellis. So they don't have any other defensemen who are really first pair players. And they have Sean Couturier, who I think is marginally a first line center. And that's been the issue. That the structure and trying to get these guys to play together and have some kind of cohesion. If Tortorella can give them some of these other elements, then it's just a matter of trying to be patient and get your hands on some of these picks like Los Angeles was able to do, even though they kept Kopitar, Brown, Quick, and Doughty.
What's interesting about the Los Angeles situation, though, is that, yeah, they were much better than people expected this year. And I talked about this before, but if you look at the players who are having success on their team, all the kids they drafted high, those kids haven't developed. Like Alex Turcotte was a top 5 pick for them. He's nowhere. He's been a huge bust. Quentin Byfield has not been as expected. He was a number 2 pick. Like even some of the later first round or second round pick guys on that roster who were supposed to really contribute haven't. So I understand what you're saying about what the Kings have done, but it's not the high draft picks the Kings have had that added to them being as good as they were this year. Like it was resurgences from some of those young players.
Yeah, not only
some of the older players.
But Kaliev was actually pretty good. He scored some goals and stuff. And Dursey, they had some younger guys that came out of nowhere. And then had Kempe, who took forever, who became a player. Boy, when you watched, was it Adrian Kempe? I mean, he was just a different player than he had been. And because the light goes on. So what the Kings are gambling, and I think it's a good gamble because Byfield's probably better than anybody the Flyers had in the Hextall era. And probably at least as good, if not better, than Patrick was supposed to be. They're saying we believe it's going to happen. We've seen enough indicators that it's going to happen. But if you look at Toronto, they got some really high draft picks. They had some luck and did what they did, but they got rid of a lot of guys like Phil Kessel and some other players like the center in St. Louis, who's still actually pretty good. I can't think of his name.
Okay.
Right, Tyler Bozak. And some players like that were mainstays on a mediocre Toronto team that was basically going nowhere. But the point I'm making is if there's enough talent here that they can have like a 70-point year and actually be better structurally, or 80-point year and be better structurally, and they can get like a number 15 pick in 23 or something, or they could make a package and move up on draft day with a veteran and get a better pick. To me, it's a better bet than just throwing it all away. And then if it doesn't work, and it likely will not work, because we see the ascendancy, you have to have 100 points to win to get in the playoffs in the Eastern Conference. And even if the Boston Bruins back out because of everything that's going on with them, wouldn't you say that New Jersey is better positioned than the Flyers to take that spot?
Of course, and then New Jersey has another high draft pick this year. They lucked out and got number 2, which there's been talk of them trading that pick for a DeBrincat. I mean, honestly, it would make more sense for them to trade the pick than the Flyers to trade their number 5 pick, because the Devils have a lot more already, young NHL talent that could be ready to make the next step. But no, I don't disagree. Again, like a rebuild would be the right path for this organization to go down, but they're just not going to go down it. So to me, it's like why even bother thinking about it?
But I wanted to get it out there because I don't want it to be like, oh, we're negative Tortorella. I know you're very happy with the hire. I'm less enthusiastic because of the management aspect and why he's coming here. In the Athletic article that talked about Tortorella wouldn't come here if it wasn't going to be, a situation where they're going to try to win, quote, right away and all that. But if you have any other comments, weigh in, because I did want to get your discussion points on what the contrasting narratives of what happened behind the scenes in the hiring process. What Anthony DeMarco was reporting, what Anthony Sanfilippo, and those guys are buddies, so it's not like a pissing contest. But Anthony Sanfilippo is kind of sticking with the reporting he came out with regarding that. I just wanted to touch on that.
Yeah. Do you want to get into that a little bit? Do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So right. So as you said, there have been a couple conflicting reports out there about how the hiring happened, what kind of role GM Chuck Fletcher had, and what kind of role this search agency had. So there's Anthony Sanfilippo wrote an article, and he's very tuned into the Flyers organization. He has good sources. Wrote an article basically saying that the Flyers had hired a company believed to be called the Coaches Agency, who helped lead their search for a head coach. And the word lead is important because other reports, including Anthony DeMarco's, have said that really Chuck Fletcher was leading the search for a head coach. But there were some rumblings that, when AV was fired, that some within the Flyers organization wanted to hire Tortorella right away. And that Chuck Fletcher didn't really think that Tortorella was the right hire for this team. And that has sort of resurfaced now in light of these reports, where you've got Anthony Sanfilippo's report first, which was basically saying that this search firm actually had more authority in leading the head coach search than Chuck Fletcher did. And that Chuck Fletcher kind of didn't really want Tortorella and hired him against his own wishes because the search firm, recommended to Dave Scott and Comcast, Tortorella is your guy. And then Anthony DeMarco came out with this report saying, from sources with the Flyers. And Anthony DeMarco has done a good job at getting some sources within the Flyers. He's had some accurate stuff this year also, saying that, well, no, that's not really true. Chuck Fletcher actually did lead this search, and that the search firm was there just as a resource. They weren't leading the charge. They were there as a resource. And I kind of believe that the truth probably lies somewhere in between, that maybe Chuck Fletcher wasn't huge on the idea of Tortorella. However, that Chuck Fletcher also did sort of have final say in who they were going to coach. And he probably took in input from, Dave Scott, Bobby Clark, Danny Briere, Brett Flair, and the search firm. I think, there is probably some truth to the thought process that some people in the Flyers organization didn't like Anthony Sanfilippo's report, even if it was fairly accurate. And so they then leaked some info to Anthony DeMarco that to the contrary, right, to kind of get that information out there. So again, I think the truth is somewhere in between. Fletcher probably didn't have Tortorella as his first choice. The Flyers apparently offered Barry Trotz $7 million a year to become the head coach, which would have made him, I think, the highest paid coach in NHL history, or top three. And Trotz turned them down, which at that point, they're basically like, okay, Tortorella's our guy. So, yeah, I mean, it sounds like they had a search firm involved. I don't think the search firm overruled Fletcher, but I think Fletcher probably wasn't enthused with Tortorella, and that's kind of where we are. And it's going to be fascinating to see what happens with Fletcher now moving forward, because he's still the GM. He's still supposed to be the one making these decisions on trades and draft picks and whatnot.
Yeah, there's a lot of dynamics here, because the idea that Fletcher didn't really cotton to Tortorella is interesting, because they say Tortorella is really tough on GMs. He'll say certain players don't fit in with his program, and he's not going to dress a guy he doesn't believe in. So there is certainly something there, because Tortorella is, if you want someone who's going to not play favorites, and this is something that this fan base has really been irritated by, then Tortorella is your man. On the other hand, that search firm in 2022 is probably as much about trying to avoid a Mike Babcock Coach Q incident, something that could come out from the past of anybody to the point of being unfair at times. But they're trying to avoid that type of incident with Comcast. And that's probably as much as any reason why they employed this firm, because they don't need that right now. They have a bad PR situation, this company and the team, as they've had at any time in their history. Just didn't have these kind of problems under Ed Snyder, and Comcast has had one issue after another.
Yeah, I think Comcast really wanted to do things right. And part of that is maybe including a search firm. And I think Comcast also wanted to make sure that people knew that they were willing to spend a lot of money to bring in a head coach. So, which is, they had that big press conference where Dave Scott said that Chuck Fletcher had an open checkbook, right, which of course means nothing with players because of the salary cap. Like, we know you're going to spend to the salary cap. The problem is there's not money, your blank check. You can't write a check over the salary cap. So the next logical thing that you could use the blank check for was a head coach, which they clearly wanted people to know, hey, they offered Barry Trotz the biggest contract in NHL history. And the Torts contract, I'm sure, it's going to be around $4.5 million a year. I think Comcast probably would not have been enthused if Chuck Fletcher came back with a recommendation of, hey, let's hire this relatively unknown coach from Sweden who is, I think is going to like his systems. Like a hire like Dave Haxtell was never going to fly, I don't think, with Comcast. So from that respect, Chuck's hands were probably a little bit tied. But I also don't think that he was totally forced to hire Torts. But it does seem like, and we've talked about Torts. I wanted to say this. He does kind of seem like the perfect Philly coach, right? Like, you watch all these clips from him. There's a great video clip, him talking about how much he hates the Penguins and how they're a bunch of whiny, especially the two guys, Malkin and Crosby, about how they're whiners and they get all the calls. Torts is a Philly guy. He was a New York guy. He's a Philly guy. Like, this is sort of like a match made in heaven. And it makes sense that Tortorella who I think was born in Philly, but I think that he was pushing hard to be the Flyers coach. Like, he in many ways is the perfect Philadelphia fit. I just wish there was more talent that he'd have here.
I thought he was born in Boston.
Was he? Maybe.
Was he just raised in Boston?
I don't know. I read that somewhere, but certainly might not be true.
Well, he was born with Philly spirit. I don't doubt that at all. But regardless, the other issue is like, okay, yeah, we know that John Tortorella is a fiery coach. He has a successful record and all that. But, he hasn't, his teams, but I'm going to read this. Torts, aside from the Cup in 2004, have not had many long playoff runs. 8 of his 20 teams missed the playoffs. 6 of his teams had first-round exits. So 14 of his teams didn't win a playoff series. So you're talking about the Flyers with a team won playoff series in 10 years. So that you could say, okay, well, let's contextualize that. How much talent did Columbus have for the longest time as players were trying to get out of there for all that time? And then what he did with the Rangers, he basically molded that team from the bottom after he came there. And AV took his team, and with a little bit more of an offensive style, they went to the finals. So
the idea that Tortorella is a quick burnout coach is nonsense. People said that about AV, and that looks like that was probably right. But you look at Tortorella, like, he was with the Lightning for 7 years. He was with the Rangers for 5 years. The one quick burnout was with the Canucks when he went in there, and they actually had more wins than losses if you throw out the overtime ones. But he went in there, and he wanted to separate the Sedins. I think it was, it just wasn't a fit there in Vancouver. And then he
Right.
was in Columbus for 60 seasons. And as you mentioned, that team, every year they lost guys from free agency. Like no one wanted to play in Columbus. And he was
Yeah.
dealing with that. And he always did a great job with what he had there. And so people talk about his lack of recent playoff success. Look at the teams he had and who they were playing against. Like the Columbus, I think one year was up 2-0 or 3-0 against Tampa. And then they ended up blowing the series, and Tampa went on to win the Stanley Cup. But like, show me the year that Columbus was supposed to win playoff series. I always thought that he did a really good job with what he had to work with on those Columbus teams. And he's not a coach that burns out quickly because of the things I talked about earlier, that he cares and his communication skills. There's a lot of young guys on the Flyers who I think Torts is going to figure out who he likes and gravitate towards players and help out the careers of some of these young guys. So, and the Flyers are paying Vigneault, what, $5 million a year for the next 2 or 3 years? Like, they're not, that's the thing. If this team stinks at the beginning of the season, they're not firing Tortorella. Like, it's not going to happen. So these players are stuck with this guy, and it's going to be for a period of time. Now, Fletcher's job may be in jeopardy if they stink, but
yeah. I mean, this is the thing where it's important to try to discern whether Chuck was on board, because he's not going to get another hire. I mean, it's just not happening. Tortorella is going to outlast Fletcher, probably. And the thing is, Tortorella, one last thing about him, he is totally invested. That is the thing. He's not going to check out. It's just not his nature. So when you look at this roster and you look at Columbus all these years, he's the one that built that culture. He really is. And they've always been tough to play against. They've always seemed to punch above their weight. And yeah, they'll go down to defeat ultimately to a better team. But this is what the fans, it's why a lot of fans don't even care about winning or losing. They want to see certain players be held accountable, because they know if that doesn't happen, they'll never win anyway. That seems to be a prevailing sentiment among a significant number of fans. And they're looking forward to Tortorella doing his thing and holding players accountable alone, because they don't think that that's really been done effectively. I mean, AV tried to do it, but then, like we talked about, he really checked out and he just wasn't interested anymore.
Right. Yeah. No, I completely agree with all that.
So they're going to have a Zoom call today at 1:00. I don't think we're going to learn a lot. There is going to be a live press conference to be determined. So I'm glad we got this in today, because I wanted to weigh in on this. Because look, the coach was really a very important aspect of this thing, and it kind of would point to the direction. We've been discussing that the entire show. And this, if the season is not going to go well, at least we'll be able to look back at the offseason that preceded it and say, well, it was a fun ride. Because that's what's going to happen. They're going to try and remake this roster, because it is very difficult to do so in season. I'd like the Flyers to be a little bit more bold in that regard. But the main changes are going to take place between now and training camp.
Yeah, the draft is in early July, and it's going to be fascinating to see what happens. Again, I'm sure we'll have an episode before the draft, but it seems that there's, and you never know what's going to happen, especially in a year like this. But the most noise right now for the Flyers is with two players. One's a defenseman who I really like, named David Jiricek. From the Czech Republic, who it's got a booming shot from the point, great power play quarterback from that perspective. He's physical. He's right-handed. He's like, to me, and a lot of people are talking about the draft going like Shane Wright 1, Juraj Slafkovsky's 2, Logan Cooley 3, and the other defenseman, Nemec 4th.
Right. Which
would put the Flyers in a spot where Jiricek is available. And actually, Elite Prospects, who does a great draft guide, they had Jiricek. They just came out with their draft guide, and he's second overall. And they look at upside is what they look at.
Right.
So he's a guy who I think would be just perfect. But there's been a lot of noise about the Flyers taking a big kid from the U.S. National Development Program named Cutter Gauthier.
Yes.
Who guys like Scott Wheeler with the Athletic barely has in his top 20. But there's been a lot of noise recently about teams because of Gauthier's big build, and he's kind of like, think Jeff Carter, like he's tall, he's big, he's ripped, he's a pretty good skater, about him going like 5 to the Flyers or 6 to the Blue Jackets. And again, these scouts know more than I do, but it seems like it'd be fairly risky. So I'm sort of getting ready to be upset if the Flyers take a guy like Gauthier 5th. We'll talk more about the draft, but the draft's going to be pivotal with seeing what the Flyers do with trying to get rid of JVR. Are they going to try and trade Konechny? What other moves are they going to make? Are they going to hold on to that, number 5 pick? Are they going to try and trade one of the 2023 third-round picks they've got? They've got 3 of them to try and get up into the second round this year. I don't know, but there's a lot of fascinating storylines.
Yeah, definitely. Just one blurb about Gauthier. I think his situation is somewhat analogous to Pierre-Luc Dubois, a winger who they projected could be a center. We went back to junior, and Columbus took a chance on him, and it turned out they were right. I mean, he had that one incident with Tortorella, but he wanted to get out of town and showed his immaturity. But frankly, it worked out for them. He moved to center, played very effectively, and lived up to his talent. But I don't think Gauthier is rated as high at this stage of the game as Pierre-Luc Dubois is at a similar stage. So we'll have to see. And yes, we will have a draft preview show and someone that you'll have some good conversations with. So, yeah. We're going to hear from Torts later. Dan, anything else on your mind about what the Flyers are doing with this hire?
No, I think we've talked about it ad nauseum. I mean, it's I don't think anyone disagrees that he's the kind of personality that this team needs to try and improve their play for next season. I think that the people mainly who don't like the hire don't like it because they think it signals that the organization isn't going to be doing a complete rebuild, which they're not. They're just not going to do that. So considering the fact that was never going to happen, I think it's a pretty good hire.
Yeah, I'm on board with that. I think he's the right guy. He matches the tenor of the city, like you said earlier, and it's not going to be boring, that's for sure. When his press conferences alone, they're going to have his higher ratings maybe than some of the games. Yeah. So with that, we're going to leave it there. Just a reminder to follow the OMB Puckcast at OMB Puck, at OMB Puck on Twitter. We have an account on Getter. And, of course, we're on all these platforms, Apple Podcast. And if you could subscribe on your favorite platform, it's really important, the subscriptions. It moves us up the charts when people are looking for Philadelphia Flyer broadcasts. And, of course, we're on Spotify, SoundCloud for now. But we're going to be on all the other ones that you could think of, including YouTube. Hit that notification bell when a new OMB podcast hits the air. And with that, Dan, just contact info and see you on the way out.
Yeah, folks can find me on Twitter at dsilver88. And yeah, let's see what happens over the next little bit. Probably, I'm really quick. One guy I'm surprised the Flyers haven't re-signed yet is Zach McEwen, unless they did and I missed it. But I thought he was like a slam dunk re-sign for the Flyers. They haven't done it yet, but just a total aside.
Yeah, I'm curious whether you would think he would be a Torts kind of player, but maybe they wanted to wait for the coach for a guy who's kind of marginal like that. I mean, he kind of is a 13th forward on a.
But they re-signed Sealer, right? Was it?
Yeah, but he's a backup player. So they needed defensive depth. You always need defensive depth. So they probably thought he was better than Connaughton, and Connaughton, somebody used to play for Torts, I believe. So yeah, that's not a bad point though. So, and people can follow you at
dsilver88.
Right. You can follow me at Isaiah, ISAIAH _520. Isaiah, don't forget the _520. We'll be back. We'll talk about the press conference and probably the media availability when they're there live. And until then, everybody, take care.